Okay, we're going to start this session. Good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program, featuring our guest speaker, Daniel Teklu. Thank you, Mr. Teklu, and to everyone who has joined us in person, online today. I am Sunday Goshit. I'm an adjunct assistant professor with the International Studies program at the University of Iowa, and also a member of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's board and program committee. The Iowa City Foreign Relations Council wants to acknowledge and thank its donors, members, sponsors, and partners for their support. This list includes the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, Taxes Plus, City Council, City Channel 4 for providing online access to Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. Iowa City Foreign Relations Council has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. The Iowa City Foreign Relations Council recognizes that our home community, the Iowa City, now occupies the homelands of Native American nations, to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. You can find the full text of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's acknowledgement on its website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure that you know where your video and audio unmute buttons are located. You are already muted, so we ask you to please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation, so you do not interrupt the speaker. Following our speaker's presentation, at about 12:45, we will have a 15-minute question and answer session. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. Now, I would like to go on and introduce our speaker, Daniel Teklu. Daniel Teshom Teklu is a second-year Doctor of Judicial Science student in International and Comparative Law, at the University of Iowa College of Law. He is currently writing a dissertation on the Nile water dispute. Daniel is from Ethiopia. He came to the United States as a young man, high school junior. In 2012, he graduated from the University of Cincinnati with a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering and works as an engineer for a few companies, including Messier Bugatti and Ford Motor Company, before turning to the study of law. In 2019, he graduated from Wayne State University Law School, Detroit, with a Juris Doctor degree. In 2021, he graduated from Indiana University Purdue University School of Law in Indianapolis with a Master's of Law degree in International and Comparative Law. He wrote his master's thesis on the Nile water dispute. At this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Teklu. Join me in welcoming Daniel Teklu, Doctor to be soon.
Soon.
Talk about the Nile water dispute from international law perspective. Daniel, the stage is yours.
All right, thanks so much. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. Thank you, the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Professor Sarah Mitchell from the Political Science Department, as well as Professor John Wrights from the College of Law and Professor Jonathan Carlson from the College of Law for helping me develop some of these ideas. What I'm presenting today is a work in progress. My topic is the Nile water dispute, an international law perspective. The pictures, I'm assuming you can see the PowerPoint, right? So you can see the PowerPoints, okay. The pictures were taken from various locations in the Nile Basin. At the top left corner, you have the Blue Nile Falls in Ethiopia. At the top right corner, you have the Sood Swamp. This is the largest swamp in the world. It's the size of the US state of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. It's quite an extensive swamp area. At the bottom left is Lake Victoria from Uganda. And at the bottom right is Egypt, close to Alexandria, where the Nile water enters into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It traverses 4,400 miles. That's about the same distance as the crow flies from New York City to Los Angeles and then 3/4 of the way to Hawaii. So it's quite a distance. There are 11 riparian states in the basin. Over 1,000 languages are spoken in the Nile Basin. The population of the basin was estimated at about 437 million, close to 500 million in 2013. And the population is expected to reach 861 million by 2050. As you can see from the map, there are two main streams to the main Nile River. There's the Blue Nile River originating from the Ethiopian highlands, and the White Nile originating from the Lake Victoria area. The Blue Nile is a highly seasonal river. It floods in the summer season when there's a lot of rain in the Ethiopian highlands. It accounts, especially during the rainy season, it accounts from 86 to 95% of the waters of the Nile River. The White Nile provides quite a steady stream throughout the year. The reason they call it the Blue Nile is because of the sediment it carries. It washes away a lot of topsoil from the Ethiopian highlands. By the way, this is the origin of the 365-day calendar that we use to this day. The ancient Egyptians counted the number of days it took for 2 successive Nile floods, and it comes to 365 days. So it takes 365 days between 2 summer floods flowing from Ethiopia to Egypt. So as you can see, top left, Blue Nile, a lot of sediment, a lot of topsoil being washed away from the Ethiopian highlands. And at the bottom right, you see the White Nile, not so much sediment, and this river originates from the Lake Victoria area. So there are 11 countries, we said, in the Nile Basin. They have varying water potential. I was able to put up some pictures, but not all the pictures for all the countries. As you can tell from this picture at a glance, they have different water potential. So you can see Egypt, Sudan, quite arid places, Eritrea, quite arid as well. Ethiopia, quite green, DR Congo, green, Uganda, very green. To put numbers to this, the annual amount of rainfall the Egyptians get is about 10 millimeters a year, 10 millimeters. In Sudan, it's not much better. It's 25 millimeters a year. In Uganda, the Equatorial Lakes region, it's estimated at 1,700 millimeters of rainfall a year. In Ethiopia, the origin of the Blue Nile stream of the Nile River, it's about 2,500 millimeters. So you can tell the different countries have different water capacities. So what is the Nile water dispute? So this dispute involves a hydroelectric dam that is being built on the headwaters of the Blue Nile River. Ethiopia is building this project. It's a large project and it's quite controversial for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is that it's being built by the headwaters nation, which provides the majority of the waters of the Nile. So if the majority of the waters are being kept back, there will be detriment to the lower riparian states, specifically Sudan and Egypt. The other reason it's controversial is because of its size. Upon completion, it's expected to hold up to 74 billion cubic meters of water. For comparative purposes, the amount of water the Nile discharges in a given year is 84 billion. So about 90% of the Nile's annual flow could be held back by this dam. That is why it is quite controversial. The project took about 4.2 billion to construct. The lower riparian states, Egypt and Sudan, were able to lobby a lot of banks, international entities, not to lend the money necessary for the project. So the Ethiopian government had to finance this domestically by raising taxes and selling bonds. In some cases, actually forcing people to buy bonds. So that's how the project was implemented. The project is still ongoing. It was started in 2011, and this is significant. It's significant for this reason. So what you see in the picture are citizens of Cairo that have come out to protest against the dictatorship of President Hosni Mubarak. I believe this picture was taken in 2011, January of 2011. This is part of the Arab Spring protests. As some of you will recall, the Arab Spring protests started when a fruit vendor, a man named Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in Tunisia. He was protesting government repression, economic stagnation and whatnot. And a lot of countries, especially in the Arab world and the Islamic world, sympathized. A lot of people empathized, and people came out in numbers to protest dictatorship in their respective countries. We know that the Arab Springs reached Egypt and then later on Syria also. Arguably, the Arab Spring in Syria is still ongoing, has not been resolved. But back to our purposes, while this protests were taking place in Egypt, the Ethiopian government was gauging what was happening in Cairo. When the Ethiopian government became convinced that these protests are going to get out of hand and they cannot be handled, Ethiopia launched its hydroelectric dam project. Of course, the Egyptian government asked Ethiopia to pause the project. Ethiopia refused, of course, and the reason was the whole point of launching the project in March 2011, during the Arab Spring protests in Egypt, is to present the dam as a fait accompli. So, of course, Ethiopia refused to oblige. So that's the crux of the whole discussion. As a side note, perhaps you can notice the tanks behind the protesters. Those are US-built tanks that came in handy when it came to suppressing the democratic demands of the people, but that's another presentation altogether. So to put matters into perspective, the Ethiopian dam is not the only dam in the region. There are several dams there. I just have put up just a few of them. Toshka irrigation project in Egypt. The construction started in the 1990s, is still ongoing. The Aswan High Dam project built from 1954 to 72, Rosaries Dam in the early 1960s, and the Owen Falls Dam in the early 50s, I believe. It was a British project. At the time, Uganda was, I believe, under British protection. Well, colonization is a better way to put it. But again, the Ethiopian project is more controversial than any of these projects because it is being built by Ethiopia, which is the supplier of most of the waters of the Nile, and the size of the dam reservoir that is attached to the dam. Of course, we'll discuss some of the legal issues, but before we get there, there are some other factors which I think should always be kept in mind. So what you see in this cartoon, the person you see holding the knife is the Chancellor of Germany, well, Prussia, Otto von Bismarck. He had this idea that the European colonial powers should come together and agree to carve up the African continent. It would contribute to building peaceful coexistence, not coexistence with the Africans, of course not, but peaceful coexistence amongst the colonial powers. This affects some of the agreements that we will discuss in the coming slides. So there's this colonial legacy that should always be kept in mind. Out of the 11 riparian states in the Nile Basin, 10 of them were colonies at some point. Ethiopia was an exception. Ethiopia became an exception because in the 1890s, Italy wanted to expand from the trading post they have in Assab, in present-day Eritrea. They wanted to build a colony using Assab as a base, but they were defeated in Ethiopia in 1896. So their colonial dream was not realized. But they would try again in 1935. They succeeded in capturing the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, with a lot of help from chemical and biological weapons. And they would stay in Addis Ababa until 1941. During their stay, they committed all sorts of atrocities. The major one being the massacre of Addis Ababa, 20,000 people killed over the course of 3 days. The whole point was to terrorize the people into submitting that even if they've won the 1896 battle, they've lost the 1935 one. But at any rate, they were expelled with the help of Ethiopian guerrillas as well as the British Army. But going back to the Nile, the Bismarck's idea didn't last for too long because the cartoon you see here was made after the Berlin Conference in 1884, when the European powers came together to agree on how to carve up Africa. Just a few years later, in 1898, Britain and France get into a confrontation because the French got it into their heads that they're going to force the British to quit Egypt. And the way to do that would be to control the headwaters of the Nile. There was an incident at Fashoda, present-day South Sudan. The British carried the day. So they stayed in Egypt. So another factor that should always be kept in mind, we'll turn to the legal issues, but colonialism is one aspect that should be kept in mind. The other aspect is great power politics. So the variety of alliances you can form help you develop the capacities you need to undertake certain projects. A good example is the Aswan High Dam project. In 1952, the Egyptians had a revolution led by a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser, a very charismatic figure. They wanted to be self-sufficient in food production, industry, and those things, and they saw a need for building a dam. They requested help from the World Bank. The World Bank would not help them. The World Bank would not help them because the World Bank at the time, perhaps even now, was beholden to US interest, and the US interest basically means interest of the southern states. So the rationale at the time was, if Egypt can build a dam at Aswan, can use the waters to irrigate its farms, its cotton farms, they can sell cotton at the international market, and the revenue going to the southern states in the US producing cotton will be reduced. For that reason, the US refuses to help through the World Bank. And of course, in those days, if you can't get help from the West, you get it from the East. So the Egyptians went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was happy to oblige. Engineers from East Germany flew in to help with the dam project, so they were able to do that thing. So again, the alliances you form matter. And we have one more recent example on how the alliances you have help you. So presently, Egypt is allied with the US. Ethiopia was allied with the US until recently, but there was a change of government in Ethiopia, and the US and Ethiopia are not as friendly anymore. Why does this matter for the Niles? Well, it helps the lower riparian states like Egypt, for example, persuade the US to take Egypt's position on this dam issue. We saw this during the presidency of Donald Trump. The Egyptians somehow persuaded the US that it would be in the US interest to support the Egyptian claims, and President Trump even suggested maybe the Egyptians should bomb the dam. So this tells you the alliances you form actually matter. So I just wanted to, the 2 points, the colonialism issue and also the great power politics, I wanted to mention those as factors that should be kept in mind. In other words, it's not simply legal issues. There are many factors. We're just trying to discuss some of them today. So the specific legal issue we're trying to address is this. Did Ethiopia violate international law when it constructed the Renaissance Dam and when it diverted water from the Nile to fill the dam? Ethiopia has conducted 3 dam fillings during the summer. So it rains a lot in the Ethiopian highlands in the summer. So the fillings of the dam are done during the summer season. So at the present, there's about 20 billion cubic meters of water being held back by the Ethiopian dam. So now we have identified our legal issue. Once you have an issue in international law, you have to go through your sources of international law. According to the statute of the International Court of Justice, Article 38, sub-article 1, I might add, there are 3 main sources and 2 subsidiary means for determining rules of law. So the main sources are custom. This is basically what states do. Treaties are agreements. Judicial decisions. It should be noted, there is no stare decisis effect in international law in the manner of the common law tradition, but you can look at court decisions to help you understand some terms in agreements. The subsidiary means are the teachings or the writings of academics, and of course, general principles. So the general principles which I don't have listed here, they're not relevant to us, are basically legal notions that the various legal systems share. A good example would be a person is expected to be allowed to speak in their own defense. That is a value, if you will, shared by many legal systems, the common law tradition, the Court Napoleon tradition, as well as the religious legal systems. But for our purposes, custom treaties, and we'll touch on judicial decisions. So again, our legal issue, whether Ethiopia violated the dam, and we have our sources of law. So there are two principles we're concerned with. One is called equitable and reasonable utilization. The other one is called the no significant harm principle. These are customary rules of non-navigational uses. These are not the only principles governing non-navigational uses. There are more than two, but we're only interested in the two for now. These principles have now been codified in a convention adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1997. So what is equitable and reasonable utilization? The idea is this: you're supposed to utilize your water course in an equitable and reasonable manner. So what that means is there are certain factors in the UN Convention that you're supposed to look at that tell you whether or not your utilization is equitable or not. I've mentioned only one factor here. There are several factors. You're supposed to consider the history of the basin, the geography of the basin, the settlement patterns in the basin, so on and so forth. The other principle we're interested in is the no significant harm principle. The idea, again, is very intuitive. You're supposed to take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of harm to your neighbors, to your fellow riparian states, I should say. So all appropriate measures to eliminate or mitigate such harm. It's clear from the language that the equitable reasonable utilization supersedes the no significant harm principle. You can cause harm so long as your utilization is equitable. So the no significant harm principle is not a principle of result, it is a principle of due diligence. Some of the rules you extract from some court decisions, there aren't too many International Court of Justice decisions, but the idea is this: you cannot consider your utilization, your state's utilization, to be equitable and reasonable if you have assumed complete control or unilateral control of an international river. It makes sense. If you fail to take into account the interests of the other riparian states, your utilization is not equitable and reasonable. If you allow your territory to be used to harm other states, if you fail to consider the environmental protection of the international river, if you pollute the river, in other words, your utilization is not equitable and reasonable. So now we come to the legal regime in the Nile Basin. We have several agreements here. Some of them are relevant to us. We'll look at some of the relevant provisions. One of the earliest agreements we have on water use was signed by Britain and Italy. Earlier on, we saw a cartoon of Bismarck carving up the African continent. Basically, in the interest of colonialist solidarity, if you will, the Italians wanted to reach an agreement with Britain. The Italians had designs in Ethiopia. They wanted to expand from their trading post in present-day Eritrea, Assab region, but they ended up failing. But the reason they have this agreement was they wanted to promise the British they will not affect the water security of Britain. Britain is interested in maintaining its colony in Egypt. So the British were okay with this. As long as the waters of the Nile were not touched, they were okay with it. So the Italians were quite happy to have gotten with this agreement, but it didn't work out for them because they were defeated in Ethiopia in 1896. That automatically nullifies the agreement. Then we have the 1902 agreement. This agreement is quite helpful for the Ethiopian side because having defeated the Italians wanted recognition by the major European powers. In those days, Britain is the major power. So they wanted recognition for sovereignty, and to be able to have that recognition, they have to give up something in return. And of course, Ethiopia had to agree to not to tamper with the flow of the Nile so that the British would get the waters of the Nile. By that point, by the agreement, by the time the 1902 agreement came about, Britain had added Egypt and the other countries in the region, I believe Kenya as well, into her list of colonies. So it was important for Britain to secure a water supply. Then we have two agreements between Britain and Egypt in 29 and 49. These are quite problematic because they were signed between Britain and the British rule in Egypt. In other words, it's an agreement between Britain and Britain. Egypt would not be fully independent until the 1952 revolution. At least that's my argument. But at any rate, we have those two agreements. In 1959, we have the first agreement after Egypt became independent from Britain and Sudan became independent from Britain and Egypt. It's an interesting situation. So Sudan was colonized by Britain as well as Egypt. They called it the Anglo-Egyptian Sudanese condominium, as if it makes it sound better. But that's what we had. And then we have the 1993 agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia after the end of the Cold War. This is significant because this is the first time the country utilizing about 85% of the waters of the Nile came to an agreement with the country supplying most, in some cases, up to 95% of the waters of the Nile. Then we have the 2010 agreement, the Nile Basin Agreement, signed by the White Nile riparian states and Ethiopia. Egypt and Sudan were conspicuously absent during the signature ceremony, and the reason was there was no recognition for their historic and prior rights. They wanted recognition that the 1959 agreement, which we'll see in a minute, be recognized in the 2010 agreement. It was not there, so they refused to sign. And of course, we have the last agreement, which recognizes the two principles we mentioned earlier: equitable reasonable utilization and no significant harm. So we have some relevant provision here. In the 1902 agreement, like I said, the Ethiopians needed recognition from Britain, and the British wanted to secure the flow of the Nile to their Egyptian colony and the Sudanese colony as well. So the Ethiopian side agreed not to construct or allow to be constructed any work which would arrest the flow of the waters of the Nile, except in agreement with the British government and the government of Sudan. It's quite interesting here. The government of Sudan referred to here is not the present riparian state of Sudan. It is the British government ruling in Sudan called the government of Sudan. It's quite clever how the British do things. So Sudan would not become independent until the 50s, but this is a 1902 agreement. At any rate, they're listed here. And of course, this agreement is not relevant now. It has been nullified because once the two countries become independent, they have the opportunity to succeed the colonial ruler Britain into the agreement, but to do that under the customary rules of treaty, state succession for the purpose of treaty, they have to have the consent of the other party, which refused to give consent in 1952. The other agreement, I think an important agreement, is the 1929 agreement. Again, Egyptian sovereignty or independence is not quite clear at this point. The British are stationed in Egypt, but at any rate, there's an agreement between Britain and the government of Egypt ruled by the British in Egypt. So there you have it. But the significance of this principle, this agreement, is that it tried to enshrine a certain principle. The principle is a veto power by the lowest riparian state, Egypt, on any water project in the Nile Basin. This is a critical agreement, a critical point to be kept in mind. So the notion is Egypt has to approve any project in the basin. So it's quite an important provision for the lower riparian state argument. Then we have the 1959 agreement. Here you notice certain projects being outlined in these provisions: the Sud Al Ali, or the Aswan Dam project in Egypt, and the Rosaris Dam project in Sudan. This is pursuant to the 1929 agreement, which required Egyptian approval for any project. So this is the principle enshrined in the 1929 agreement being carried out in practice, Egypt approving certain projects here. Another interesting feature here, which I should have listed, is that the two countries are located for themselves 100% of the waters of the Nile. So Egypt would get 66%, Sudan will get the remaining 34%, there's no water allocated for any of the other riparian states, which obviously becomes problematic for the other countries. Another point to be made here is the entity that actually signed this agreement is called the United Arab Republic and Sudan. So the United Arab Republic is the union of two countries that lasted from 58 to 61. It united Egypt and Syria as a united republic. The idea was to build a strong fortress against Israel. Of course, it didn't last too long. There was a coup d'etat in Syria, and that was the end of the United Arab Republic. Egypt continued to call itself the Arab Republic for many more years, until 77, I believe. But the agreement says nothing about how Syria was going to be provided with the waters of the Nile River. Moving on, we have the 1993 agreement. The Cold War has ended. This is the first agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia, the country utilizing most of the waters of the Nile and the country supplying most of the waters of the Nile. The end of the Cold War matters. There was a military regime in Ethiopia subsidized by the USSR. So this military entity, the military government, is overthrown. So that brings about the possibility for peace. You can notice here, there's this mention of not causing appreciable harm to your fellow riparian state. Arguably, this is a lower threshold of harm than the no significant harm principle, but you can see the influence from the customary law was being filtered into the Nile Basin. Then we have the 2010 agreement. This was signed by 6 countries in the Nile Basin, including Ethiopia. Egypt and Sudan were conspicuously absent. Like we said, they wanted recognition for the 100% claim they were making on the Nile waters on the basis of the 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan. There was no guarantees in this agreement for Egypt's and Sudan's prior or historic rights on the Nile. But you can notice the language we've seen already in the customary law section. It replicates the customary rules of international water law. What's interesting is this countries, none of the 9 riparian states are parties to the UN Convention, and yet they have replicated the convention's language on this, at least to these 2 principles, the equitable, reasonable utilization principle, as well as the no significant harm principle. We have the last agreement here between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Again, the language is similar. You have to try to avoid significant harm to your neighbors. You're supposed to use the waters in an equitable, reasonable manner. In the picture you see at the top left, you have President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt. In the middle, President Omar al-Bashir of the Sudan, incidentally wanted by the International Criminal Court for genocide in Darfur. On the right-hand side, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn. So the Egyptian president and the Ethiopian prime minister are not wanted by the International Criminal Court, not yet anyway, but there you have it. So again, we've seen this language. It replicates the customary law codified in the UN Convention. So we're back to our legal issue, which said we wanted to determine whether or not Ethiopia violated international law when it built the dam and diverted water from the dam. Now we have a source of law, and the source of law is the 2015 Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan agreement signed in Khartoum. Now, something interesting happens. So what happens when you have a country or a group of countries that sign agreements and ratify them? Well, that's straightforward. It would be binding on those states. But suppose this country sign an agreement but fail to ratify it. What's those states' responsibilities? Under the customary rules, again, we keep mentioning customary rule. Customary rules are quite indispensable in international law. So under customary rules codified as the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, if you have signed an agreement and ratified it through your legislative system, you have an obligation to perform it in good faith, pacta sunt servanda. But suppose you've signed an agreement but have not ratified it, your obligation is to refrain from acts which defeat the object and purpose of a treaty. In other words, you're not expected to perform the treaty in good faith, nor are you expected to perform the treaty to its fullest extent possible, but merely to refrain from acts which would defeat the object and purpose of a treaty. So our source of law is a 2015 agreement. What was the object and purpose of the 2015 agreement? It was to commit the signatories to the equitable and reasonable utilization principle. So now the legal question becomes, does Ethiopia's construction of the dam violate the, or rather defeat the object and purpose of the agreement? In other words, did Ethiopia's construction violate the equitable reasonable utilization principle and the no significant harm principle? Again, we've seen this language. I'm showing it here again. We've also seen this, the rules extracted from some judicial decisions. You're not supposed to take unilateral control if you're claiming your use is equitable and reasonable. And you cannot fail to take into account the interests of the other riparian states if you're claiming your utilization is equitable and reasonable. So now the question becomes, did Ethiopia assume unilateral control during the construction and water diversion for the project? And did Ethiopia fail to take into account the interests of the other riparian states? So now we're putting everything together. So these are factual considerations. There's a lot of conflicting narrative. On the unilateral control aspect, I think it's quite difficult to lay claim to an entire water source unless you have the facilities to put all this water. It's 74 billion cubic meters a year. So it's quite difficult for Ethiopia to do anything with this much water. It rains a lot in Ethiopia. So not to mention the 122 billion cubic meters available from other water sources in Ethiopia. So I don't think there's much argument as far as unilateral control. Now, how about taking into account the interests of the other riparian states? I think some aspects of the interests of the other riparian states were taken into account. Like we mentioned, there were 3 fillings conducted over the summer, and this was done during the heavy rainy season in the Ethiopian highlands. So I suppose that's what some argument to say that there was an interest or an effort was made to take into account the interests of the other riparian states. But these are facts, right? Factual considerations, and opinions will necessarily differ. So for our present purpose, excuse me, we will assume the worst case scenario. In other words, we'll assume that Ethiopia had actually taken unilateral control and had failed to take into account the interest of the other riparian states. Then what happens, right? This happens. Again, we're back to customary rules. So under the customary rules, codified as articles of responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, states are responsible for their conduct. Each state is responsible for its own acts. There are 2 elements to this. There's attribution and there's breach. What we've been talking about so far is breach. So you would have a breach of an international obligation. In the present case, if you've assumed unilateral control of a common water course and you fail to take into account the interests of the other countries, what is the source of our obligation? It's the same as the source of law, which is the 2015 agreement. So supposing there was a breach, the attribution part is very easy. There's no dispute that Ethiopia is the one building the dam and diverting the waters. What of it? What happens then? Well, if this is the case, then it's under the customary rules. I'm not saying they will do it, but under the customary rules, Ethiopia would have to stop working on the dam. Ethiopia would also have to offer assurances that these things will not be repeated. Ethiopia will have to stop diverting water to fill the dam. Again, we're assuming a lot of facts, but if this is an international wrongful act, under the customary rules, Ethiopia is supposed to act. Ethiopia is supposed to stop the act. But that's not the end of it. Ethiopia would have to make full reparations to Egypt and Sudan. Again, a lot of assumptions, a lot of suppositions. If Ethiopia had assumed unilateral control and had failed to take into account the interests of Egypt and Sudan, Ethiopia would have to make full reparations to them. Full reparations mean restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. Restitution basically means Ethiopia would have to release all the water, the 20 billion cubic meters of water being held back by the dam. Compensation is money. If there's damage to, say, Egyptian farmers, Sudanese farmers harmed by Ethiopia's withdrawal of water, that I'm assuming would be financially accessible, so that's compensation. Satisfaction means Ethiopia would have to acknowledge that it was wrong for having built the dam, has to express regret for having built the dam, and has to apologize for having built the dam. That's basically what it means. So once you have all the customary rules in your favor, you have to go to court to have this enforced. And the court of choice is the International Court of Justice, but you run into a problem. The problem we have is at least from the Egyptian and Sudanese perspectives, is the jurisdictional statute, which requires states to accept the court's jurisdiction as compulsory before they can be dragged to court. Once the court ascertains jurisdiction, it can address interpretation of treaties, it can address questions in international law, but the court has to have jurisdiction. And Egypt has accepted the court's jurisdiction, but only for Suez Canal issues. Sudan has accepted the court's jurisdiction as compulsory, and Ethiopia has refused to accept the court's jurisdiction as compulsory. So there's no way for Egypt and Sudan to take Ethiopia to court and demand reparations, restitution, compensation, or satisfaction. But that is not the end of it. There is this agreement we saw earlier, which is still open for signature, the 2010 agreement between 6 riparian states in the basin. This was the agreement that the Egyptians and the Sudanese governments refused to sign because they would not recognize the claim they were making to 100% of the waters of the Nile via the 1959 agreement. But if they sign this agreement, then it gives them a way through which they can take Ethiopia to the International Court of Justice. Ethiopia has signed the agreement and has also ratified the agreement. So it would be possible for them to take the Ethiopian government to court. So to just briefly summarize what we've discussed so far, Egypt and Sudan's claim on the Nile waters is based on water need. They can't survive without the Nile. It's as simple as that. We mentioned Egypt had 10 millimeters of water a year, Sudan 25 millimeters, Ethiopia 2,500 millimeters a year. On the Ethiopian side of the claim, it's about development, economic progress, growth. But Ethiopia has survived without the Nile up to this point for thousands of years, I may add. It can continue to do so is the argument the Egyptians put forth. But the Ethiopians argue we need this for development, our population is rising, and that's true as well. But on the legal side, unless the Egyptians and the Sudanese join the 2010 agreement, there is no legal forum for them to bring the case to International Court of Justice to get restitution, compensation, or satisfaction, in other words, apology. I think that's my time. So that's what I have.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.
It's question and answer time. We now move to the question and answers portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. And feel free to turn on your video function, but please keep yourself mute. While we are waiting for questions, I've seen one come in. The Iowa City Foreign Relations Council wants to thank its members and donors for their support. If you would like to join the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council or make a gift to support its programs, please go to our website, icfrc.org. Thank you. I have someone write in the chat. And the question here is, aside from the legal questions, what will happen when the large amount of soil in the water settles into the basin of the dam?
So I'm assuming you mean the Ethiopian dam that's being built. The same situation was developing in the. Okay, somebody says stop sharing the screen. So let me do that.
Okay.
Okay. So the question is, yes. So what happens after? So it settles. So I'm assuming the person asking the question wants to know what would happen with the Ethiopian dam, but the same situation developed in the Aswan Dam case. There was no consideration for the sediment soil settling at the bottom of the Aswan Dam. That is a problem they're dealing with now, 50 years later, and the Ethiopian side has not considered this either. So it is going to be a major engineering problem as far as the sediment from the Blue Nile River settling at the bottom of the dams. They have the same problem in the Meroe Dam in Sudan, Rosaries Dam, Sinnar Dam in Sudan. All the countries on the Blue Nile have this problem. The dams built on White Nile less so because less sediment in that water flow. But it is a relevant question, and it seems they have not addressed that to my knowledge.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I can't see any question on the chat, but if you have any questions, you can turn on your video and ask a question.
I suppose while people are thinking about some questions, I guess I can make a couple more points that I would like to have made. So there are other factors. We mentioned the legacy of colonialism. We mentioned the legacy of great power politics. I think economics matters too. There's this issue that's now becoming relevant, which is land grab agreements. So a lot of the countries in the basin need to generate revenue, a lot of poverty in the region. And also dictatorship. The relationship between the two is not for me to say, but there's countries that are not very accountable to their public, are leasing land to Gulf Arab countries with oil money to come in and grow food in the Nile Basin and ship it to their countries. And it is affecting the water balance in the basin. The culprits are basically the Ethiopians, the Sudanese. I believe the same thing was happening or was being suggested in other parts in the basin. The Gulf countries are quite arid, and they wouldn't mind developing their agricultural needs in the Nile Basin using the waters of the Nile. Okay, I see a question. What is the connection of Lake Tana to the new dam? The Lake Tana is basically the lake that from where the water originates, where the Blue Nile water originates. The dam is quite at a distance from Lake Tana. It's not at Lake Tana. It's a few hundred kilometers to the southwest of Lake Tana, but all the water that flows into the dam comes from Lake Tana. Lake Tana is basically the origin of the Blue Nile River, not to mention, of course, the rainfall.
Okay, we'll take John's question and then
Yes,
you
sir.
can answer the question that.
Thanks, Sunday. I had a kind of a complicated question, so I couldn't write it fast enough.
Okay.
You've gone. I guess I have sort of a two-part question because when I started thinking about the first question, then I realized I had a bigger question. So the bigger question is you went through a lot of agreements.
Yes.
And you made it clear that basically the two principal the two principles of international law that I think you said really are govern this situation are actually principles of customary international law.
Yes.
But there are a lot of these agreements, and the agreements are always just with certain countries, some of which don't exist anymore, and that sort of thing. So I wondered, is there any one agreement that really is important for resolving the current arrangement? I think you said that the 2015 agreement was still open for signature.
2010. Yes.
2010 agreement. And I was wondering if do agreements sometimes lapse? I mean, could it be sort of irrelevant now? But so one question is kind of what agreements are really important? If
okay,
really ultimately a question of customary international law that's involved here.
Okay.
Well, I guess that's it. And then, as I said, I was interested in knowing whether some of these agreements may have become defunct in effect.
Yes. So for one reason or another, all the agreements are defunct except for the 2010 agreement and the 2015 agreement. Now, the trouble with the 2010 agreement is only the upper riparians signed on.
Yeah.
You need the lower riparians to be parties to it. That's why. But that's one of the reasons I mentioned it, because it has this jurisdictional statute bringing the case under the ICJ. So if Egypt and Sudan can be persuaded to join it, it would be quite helpful, because the provisions there just duplicate what, or rather replicate what the customary law says on equitable use and no significant harm. But the concern for the Egyptian and the Sudanese governments is that if they recognize the 2010 agreement, that means they're giving up on their prior claim to 100% of the waters under the 59 agreement. I think from the government's perspective, it makes sense to hold out on this, because they have to answer to their public to some extent. The Nile is a very critical issue for the Sudanese public as well as for the Egyptian public. But what's interesting is they signed the agreement that came in 2015 that says the same thing that the 2010 agreement says. but they didn't ratify it. So it seems perhaps they're being cautious with their own public. They've accepted the principles already. They've already done away, at least the governments of Egypt and Sudan have done away with this idea that 100% of the water belongs to them, 66% to Egypt and the remaining to Sudan. But I don't know how they would present that to their public if it has to go through parliament and has to go through ratification. So I think that 2010 is important because it's signed and ratified by 6 countries. The 2015 is important because it's the only one that has the lower riparians as signatories. Did I answer your question, Professor? Okay, thank you.
And there's a question. I think that this question actually follows that question because it seems like Jim Giblin is asking, what about East African nations? They are in the basin, but apparently not involved in the treaties and agreements. What's the implication of that for the future?
Right, so they are involved in the 2010 agreements, but the reason, like we mentioned, they are involved in the 2010. So the East African countries I'm assuming you're thinking of are DR Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. They are involved in the process in the 2010 agreement, but because Egypt and Sudan did not join, that basically makes the agreement quite useless. But for the future, I think there's this notion that the countries are going to end up working together. The rhetoric has changed. I'll give you one example. In 1977, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt made peace with Israel, and the first thing he did was he offered to sell the waters of the Nile to the Israelis. And a journalist asks him, well, how about the Ethiopians? And the Ethiopians can go to hell, was his response. That was the rhetoric that was coming out of Egypt at the time. You don't see that kind of rhetoric. There are some exceptions, of course. There's discussions about bombing the dam and what's not, but the rhetoric has changed. I think they're moving in a direction of equitable use. That's the way the world is going. And also the benefit of the dam is obvious to the other countries too, because Egypt and Sudan are guaranteed cheaper electricity from the dam as well. I think the big problem would come when Ethiopia decides, or if Ethiopia decides to use the dam for irrigation. Hydroelectricity, I think everybody has accepted it now, but it's not so difficult to convert a hydroelectric dam into an irrigation dam if you have the political will and the resources. So I think that's the main issue for them.
Jim, do you have a follow-up?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was. I have Peter Hansen here asking, the water of the Nile cannot year after year accumulate in reservoirs in Ethiopia. Either it eventually flows over or runs through the dam, or it is somehow consumed in Ethiopia, e.g. irrigation, which you just mentioned about, or some combination of both. So after a few years, what percentage of the Nile's water will reach Egypt and Sudan?
Right, so at the present, the Ethiopian claim is that it's purely hydroelectric. We need 74 billion cubic meters. It takes about 6 to 7 years to fill the dam at a rate of, depending on the year, different rates, but the last filling, for example, was 13.5 billion cubic meters. So Egypt will get perhaps from 5 to 10% less, assuming there's no irrigation. And the idea is to maintain that water pressure because you will lose a lot of water from evaporation as well. So it would seem to be minimum, perhaps 10 to 15%. I don't have the exact number, but the trouble will begin when Ethiopia, empowered by the electricity is generating and the revenues is generating, to do other things with the dam, right? You can divert the water, so start irrigating. The Ethiopian population is rising at a higher rate than the Egyptian population, and the Sudanese population is quite small. I think 30 million or so. Egypt is 100 million, Ethiopia is about 110. So there will come a time when this will be a major irrigation issue. I think that's when they will start to have problems.
Thanks. Well, I'll go to the question that I deferred to the end. Given your expertise, how do you see your career going forward after you finish your degree? And what advice do you have for other students who are interested in international law?
Oh, that's the wrong thing to ask the wrong person. No, I'm no expert. I'm just trying to do my dissertation. And as much as I like the University of Iowa, I'm trying to do my dissertation and move on. Yeah, so I'm interested in international law. I've been fortunate enough to have had professors help me with my dissertation. Professor John Wright was my dissertation supervisor, so he was very helpful to me as well. At this point, I'm just focused on getting through the visitation phase.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. This is an excellent presentation. I think that
Thank
there's
you.
a lot
You're
of
kind.
information. Yeah. And Daniel, I am honored to virtually present you with the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's highly coveted mark for
Nice.
coffee. There it is. Kathy is showing you tea or with the beverage of your choice. And Iowa City Foreign Relations Council will arrange to deliver details with you very soon. And this is the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's last program for the fall semester. We will reconvene in mid-January, and we'll be emailing you information about our spring program schedule. In the meantime, we wish you a wonderful holiday season. And thank you so much again, Daniel, for ending the semester for us on a very, very good note. Thanks for joining us, and we are adjourned.